All right, the meeting's just preparing to live, so it'll take like one more minute and then we'll be good. All right, I think that we should be good now. So let me just get back to the Zoom and then get started. One second, sorry. Okay. Hello, everyone. Everyone's camera is working, everything's good? All right, cool. So good evening, doctors, and to everyone watching at home. I'm so excited to be here and to be co-hosting this meeting with my co-founder, Mallory Holloway. For everyone's information at home, tonight we will be discussing something that has affected every single one of our lives, the pandemic. We'll be hearing from two very different doctors, Dr. Stowens, an emergency room physician, and Dr. Walls, a pediatric psychologist. This pandemic has had drastic effects on the physical and mental health of many people, including the youth. So we're thrilled to be having this conversation. So we'll start off with introductions and then we'll get started. So I'm Mallory Murphy. I'm the executive director of Generation Activism. I'm 15. My pronouns are she, her, and I'm really excited to be here tonight. I'll give it to Mallory, the other Mallory, to you.
Hi, I'm the other Mallory. I'm communications director of Generation Activism, and my pronouns are she, her. I'm also 15, and yeah, I'm also really excited. I'll pass it to Kaylee.
Hi, I'm Kaylee. I am 17. I am the social media coordinator for Generation Activism, and I'm really excited to be here. So I'll pass it to Kate.
Hi, I'm Kate. I'm the advocacy director. My pronouns are she, her, and I'm 16. And I'll pass it to Natalie.
Hi, I'm Natalie. I just joined. I'm 16 and my pronouns are she, her.
And then Vatsala, can you keep going?
Hi, I'm Vatsala. I'm 14 and my pronouns are she, her, and I'll pass it to Krista.
Hi, I'm Krista and my pronouns are she, her. I'll pass it to you, Etsy.
Hi, my name is Dretzy. My pronouns are she, her, and I'll pass to Olivia. Hi, I'm Olivia. I am 16. My pronouns are she, her, and I will pass it to Jack.
Hi, I'm Jack. I'm 16 and my pronouns are he, him. I'll pass it to Margaret.
Hi, I'm Margaret. My pronouns are she, her. I'm 14 years old and I will pass it to Liv.
Hi, I'm Liv. My pronouns are she, her, and I just turned 18. And I'll pass it to Emma.
Hi, my name is Emma. My pronouns are she, her, and I'm 16. I'll pass it to Gabby.
Hello, I'm Gabby. My pronouns are she, her. I'm 12, and I'll pass it to Isabella.
I'm Bella. I'm 14, and my pronouns are she, her. I'll pass it to Elsa.
Hi, my name's Elsa. I'm 15. My pronouns are she, her. Who hasn't gone? Has anyone not gone?
Has Olivia gone? Yeah? Oh, sorry. All right. I think that might be everyone. Great. So before we jump into the question and answer, I just want to briefly tell everyone that is watching at home, that our member Liv will be giving a speech at the end relating to her personal experience with mental health in the pandemic. So everyone get excited for that. And without further ado, I'll pass it to Gabby to ask our first question for the night.
Hello. I was wondering, how long did you both go to school to earn your title?
Forever. So I am a psychologist. I have my doctorate degree in psychology, so a little different than Dr. Stowens, who has his medical degree. But I did 4 years of undergrad, 4.5 years of grad school, and then a year of residency, which is like clinical rotations. And then I did 2 years of fellowship. So fellowship is usually when you decide what you want to specialize in. That's a lot of years. I think the math checks out somewhere around like 10 years total, but that's counting undergrad and graduate school.
There we go. Sorry, I was muted. So I'm Justin Stowens. My pronouns are he, him, and I'm 42 years old. And much like Dr. Walls, I went to school for a while too. Anybody that goes through medical school has to do high school and college. And so after your 4 years of college, you go into medical school and you do that for 4 years. And then there's a lot of different ways through specialty training after that. After 4 years of medical school, you're a doctor, but almost every doctor that you're going to meet now usually does another 3 or 4 years. And then some of us do even more, up to maybe even 7 or 9 years of training after that. So I did 4 years of medical school and then 3 years of training to be an emergency doctor, and then an extra year of fellowship to practice using ultrasound on patients. So I don't know what that comes out to, 4, 8, 9, somewhere in there. No.
That's really cool. Thank you. I will pass it to Margaret to ask the next question.
I have another question for both of you. How does it make you feel when you see people claiming that COVID is a hoax or is not a big deal?
I think everyone around you guys could, if they've heard my conversations and with Dr. Stowens, is that we get really mad. I think that's the basic answer. I think we've had a lot of sort of rants about this, but I think, from my perspective as a psychologist, part of my job is sort of to think about why people think these things, right? And how they have access to some of these things. So, it's really frustrating, especially when you work in the medical community. So, I work at a children's hospital. Dr. Stowens works in an adult hospital. It's really frustrating when you're actually seeing sick people come in. But I think, one of the things that I think about is how easily accessible poor information is. So you guys all see the internet and TikTok and Instagram and Facebook, like you can find anything out there. So I think it's almost at this point not super surprising to me that COVID was just one more thing that people were picking at. But as I think medical professionals, it's really frustrating. And I think even for you guys at your age, one of the things that you guys can do that's really useful, because honestly, you guys are better at the internet than we are, is to figure out how to share good information and to sort of help to spread positive and right and correct information, even if it's related to medical things. But I think, I think the general thing is that it's really frustrating. And I think the other piece I'll add here is that COVID has affected people medically, which Dr. Stowens can talk to more, but we're seeing the mental health aftermath of it. So we know it's not just a real disease in that it's a medical disease, but also that we're having a lot of sort of fallout from, family members who are sick or from people losing jobs and that sort of thing.
No, I agree, especially with the starting out angry. It's tough when you're so invested in something that you know is true and important and impactful, and other people disagree with you. And so in the beginning, I think when I heard that not believing in COVID was even a thing, I was pretty angry. I saw patients very sick from this and people's families affected and people dying. And it definitely made me angry. And then after a while, I think once you get the emotion out of it, the teacher in me kind of kicked in. And I think these days I'm a little bit more curious than I am angry. I kind of want to know why somebody thinks the way they do and how they got there. And I think that's sort of the first step in helping people understand what's really going on, and sort of giving getting your point across and really coming to a purposeful place is understanding where the other person's coming from. So yeah, when we hear deniers, I keep asking myself, what are they thinking? What's their experience that led them down that thinking path? And how can it be so very different than mine? So I think that's where I am now. I'm also tired. I'll go there.
Thank you so much. That was really interesting to learn about how you deal with those difficult situations. I'll pass it to Elsa for the next question.
Hi, so I have a question for both of you. I was wondering what have been the most significant changes in the hospital environment since the start of the pandemic?
Oh, you want me to start, Megan?
Sure, go for it.
Yeah, I think actually you guys probably have a pretty good idea because you're probably going through the same thing we are. We kind of miss our friends. The hospital is a really big place where we work with our friends every day. We're part of a big team, and we get to, going to work is kind of fun because we're all kind of going towards the same goals, and we're all part of this big machine, this big process of helping people. But with COVID, it's locked down. People can't really move around as much. Just because we're taking care of patients doesn't mean that we have to be safe too. We can't be cavalier. We have to wear masks and gowns, and we don't hug each other anymore, and we don't give each other high fives. And so that is a big change from sort of working there and being a doctor. The other thing that's different about it that makes it even more quiet and a little lonely is that when patients come into the hospital, their families can't come. So we don't get to see the hundreds and hundreds of people walking around the halls of the hospital every day and having conversations and going about their lives. So it's kind of weird. It's ghostly quiet at times, just because everything is so locked down. Those are the big changes that I sort of feel every day.
Yeah, I mean, ours is we're in a little different space because we're a children's hospital. So, Dr. Stowens was seeing more sick patients, and they had more sick patients in their hospital. And so I think for us, the biggest change at first was that, also similar to you guys, a lot of us got sent home. So we were doing a lot of telehealth. We were doing a lot of, I have been sitting in this office for a bazillion hours approximately since March. So I think for us, a lot of our pediatric specialties, except for like surgery and things like that, even primary care docs got sent home. So that was a really big thing. And then as we started to go back, the other sort of thing, my job is very much to collaborate with physicians. So there are child psychologists, which do basic outpatient treatment, but pediatric psychologists train in the medical setting. So my job is really to interact with docs. And one of the huge things I've seen is that we have to figure out how to be creative about having team meetings or consults. So like Dr. Stowens said, we can't just pop in a room and talk to people. And that's been a really big change for us. I think the other thing that I think is super interesting is sort of how our mindsets have changed around things like the fact that we kind of laugh that we used to ever walk in a room with a sick kid without a mask on. It just seems like silly now. We're like, oh, we probably should have done that before. That sounds like a good idea. And then the last thing I'll say, which I think is very new, is there has been a change in my colleagues, myself included, since we've all gotten vaccinated. So everyone in my hospital who has wanted a vaccine has gotten both vaccines. And I think there is a shred of hope finally in the medical community. So I think we had these really dark days. We still are not hugging each other and hanging out without masks. I will say that too. We are being really careful, but it feels less scary now. And I think that there is some hope. And I think that we have sort of this finally light at the end of the tunnel. And so I think more recently, I think the hospital systems I think there'll be some permanent changes. I think there'll be more telehealth still going forward. I think we'll be more careful about how we do things, but it does feel like there's a little bit of a shift since we all got vaccinated too.
Thank you. That's very interesting. I'm going to pass it to Krista for the next question.
Hi, my question is for Dr. Stowens. What is it like to be working on the front lines, and how does it make you feel?
That's probably the hardest question that I'm gonna get tonight. It's a little bit of a moving target. We've watched we've watched the sort of pandemic come in these big waves through Delaware. And at times it is exhausting. You kind of feel like those cartoons you see people draw about us. And you see the tired nurses and the tired doctors. And at times it really does feel like that. But at other times, you're doing this thing that really needs to get done, and that sort of so many people have sacrificed to make work, right? Everybody that in the community that decided to lock down and to social distance and wear masks, right? They took all of these precautions so that our healthcare system wouldn't get destroyed with the really large number of people getting sick in the beginning, and that let me keep going to work and let me keep doing my job with my team and my friends. So it also, so it's tiring, but it is also really rewarding to sort of still be doing what I love to do during all of this. I think that's how I'm feeling today. We'll see how it happens in the next couple of weeks, as sort of things come back to normal in the next couple of months. Oh, does that answer your question, Krista?
Thank you, and I'll pass it to Mallory.
Hi, so I have a question for Dr. Walls. What was it like when you initially found out about Corona, and how did you kind of react to that and manage to like shift your entire job basically?
Yeah, it's a really good question. So, I think when we very first found out, it was just sort of this mad rush to figure out what we were going to do. And if some of us were going to be working from home, and how to do telehealth, and how to figure out how to sort of adjust to everything. And my job in the very beginning, so I spend half my time as a clinical psychologist. I see kids from 2 to 21, and the other half of my time is actually paid for by our government relations team at Nemours. And so some of my time was also spent trying to figure out things like, how do we get waivers to be able to see kids who can't connect to our telehealth services to use like FaceTime, right, to see you guys? Or how do we get permission to do a telephone only session if I need to with a kid? So my time was sort of spent problem solving. And when I look back, I actually think that helped me like mitigate some of that stress, because we were so worried about what to do that I think a lot of us didn't know really that the stress and panic that would happen sort of in the upcoming months were coming. So I think at the very start, it was more about problem solving and how to figure things out. But the other thing that I'll say is, Dr. Stowens sort of mentioned that the hospitals have changed and that we can't hug our friends. The other thing that I think a lot about is how, myself included, how medical professionals and how our colleagues are going to sort of deal with all of this and deal with the pandemic. So I think the other piece as a psychologist that I worried about from the beginning, and we've done a lot of work at Nemours and Christiana to sort of think about these things, is like, how are our colleagues going to be affected, and how are we all going to deal with this? Because this has been going on for a year now, right? So we also, as a psychologist, I've spent a lot of time thinking about that adjustment. And then the last thing is, I think probably everyone who is a psychologist from day one has been waiting for what's happened more recently, which is like the wave of mental health issues that's happened after this. So we sort of knew this was coming, and we've been trying to figure out how to build up our services and access to care, because, like I said, the medical disease is one thing, but then what happens when we've all been dealing with this for a year? So I think those are sort of all the things I was thinking about, but we've been really flexible. I've been really lucky to have colleagues and friends who are really supportive. And I think just like everyone else going through the pandemic stuff, finding people who are supportive and in your corner and going to sort of listen as you're going through this is really important.
Thank you for that. I think Olivia is next.
Hi, I have a question for Dr. Stowens. I was wondering if you've personally seen either patients or their families undermine the seriousness of COVID-19 and either contract it for one or eventually reverse their views upon it.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, we've all been sick before, right? We've all had coughs and colds, and it's hard to deny how bad you feel when you get this thing. So yeah, I've seen a fair amount of patients who've come in, and usually it's what's on the second visit. So what we've all seen about COVID now, and I don't know how much you know about it and have seen, but that the disease has sort of a slow worsening to it. So in the beginning, you can feel pretty good, and if you're really lucky, you stay feeling pretty good throughout the whole thing. But some people are going to get a little bit worse, and it seems to sort of come in these two little waves. So they'll come to the emergency department when they first feel symptoms, and they'll say, what do I have? What do I do? Oh gosh, do I have COVID? Do I have COVID? I don't think I have COVID. I went to the beach. I was, or whatever they decided to do, and we tell them, yeah, you got COVID, and it sort of sinks in. And you can sort of see people's minds start to churn and go, what did I do? What did I do? And they'll have conversations with their family. Well, was it the trip we took? Was it the time I went to the store? But I think the severity of it tends to set in about a week or so later, which is when that disease can get, if it's going to get worse, it gets worse. And then people feel really sick. And that, I think, is when it really hits home. And I hear people saying things like, I wish I'd made different decisions, or I wish I hadn't, wish I hadn't done X, Y, or Z. And yeah, at that point, I think they realize, and we do the absolute best we can to get them through that. And most do, and some don't. But yeah, there's definitely a sort of what you described, sort of realization that maybe they should have taken it a little bit more seriously in the beginning. But then they usually talk to a lot of people about that, which is good. And you'll hear lots of stories, or you'll see lots of tweets, or you'll hear people talking about it, and their experience will hopefully change the the mindset of other people that may not realize how bad it can be. Yeah.
Okay, thank you so much. I'll pass it on to Isabella.
My question is for Dr. Walls. So I was wondering, how do you think that distancing and doing learning virtually, how do you think that will affect children's abilities to develop social skills?
So, I think this is a great question. And I think that when I think about the answer to this, I think the answer is probably my answer to a lot of questions about young kids, which is kids react really differently to things. So I think it's really hard to put a blanket statement to say this whole generation of young kids is going to suffer from poor social skills. I think it really depends on the kids. I think it depends on what they are doing besides virtual learning, right? So are they still talking to friends? Are they even playing outside masked? How are families adapting to this? I think we're going to see a whole range of different outcomes. My guess is that it will take kids a while to adapt next year, but what we know about kids is that their brains have a lot more plasticity, which basically means they're flexible, right? So if we lose some abilities, we can get them back easily. It's a lot harder for adults. It's even actually harder for you guys as older teenagers, but kids often are pretty resilient. So I think there will probably be some kids who really struggle. I think that the kids who, perhaps don't have a lot of parental support, I think we'll probably see, just unfortunately, like everything else, some disparities in terms of lower income kids, Black and brown kids are probably going to suffer more from this. There is a lot of less support at home. A lot of those families have to do things like work hourly jobs, right? So, Dr. Stowens' kids and my kids usually have a parent home if they're doing virtual learning, but that's not the case for every kid. So I think there's going to be a lot of differences. And I think it's really hard to predict exactly the outcomes, but I think as a psychologist, one of the things that I will be looking at is, are we helping those kids who are struggling catch up? And are we sort of screening those kids? And one of my great loves in primary care is that I can see kids who are not unwell, right? So when kids come in for their well visits at age 6, I can pop in a room and check out and see how they're doing next year, because we'll probably do that more. And I think as long as we're sort of checking in, we can figure out maybe which kids are struggling socially. I think the other piece of this depends on what happens next year. So I think we're really hopeful that lots of adults will be vaccinated and that elementary at least will be safe to be in school. And I think we'll really see improvements along the way.
Thank you, that's interesting. I'll pass the next question to Vatsala.
Hi, my question is for Dr. Stowens, and it's, do you see an influx of COVID patients that are minorities, and have you seen them be treated any differently?
Two very different questions. Yes, I have, especially the first. We know that COVID. We know that COVID is disproportionately affecting communities that are Black and Brown, minority communities, and so yeah, we see more of them coming to the hospital. I think, are they being treated differently? Is a not in the way that that you might think in asking that question, right? The kind of racism that you might see on TV these days, the kind of racism that that sort of really got brought to the forefront during like the last election cycle. Not that kind of racism that I'm not seeing that in how they're treated in our hospital system. Actually, our hospital system does a pretty good job of looking for racism and making sure that it's not there. But what we do see is, like Dr. Walls was talking about, we see people coming into this disease not on the same playing field, not with the same resources at home, not with the same support system. One family might come into the hospital and their family member gets put into the hospital and they can't see them anymore, right? Because they have COVID, and so no one is allowed to visit. But they have a fancy new iPhone 12, and so they can FaceTime all the time. Just to give a sort of simple example, where another family might not have the funds for that. And so that socioeconomic disparity is highlighted more in COVID. What you might not see, the sort of uneven playing field that people are playing on, are living on, becomes really easy to see when people get really sick and need a lot more. Insurance matters a lot more, and so we see it there, and the what they call systemic racism, right? The racism that is in our society that we have to work to remove becomes really easy to see when families are put to the strain of taking care of really sick family members. And I mean, I can tell you from the hospital systems that I've worked at, the hospital system does a really good job of trying to help with that, and we're very aware of it. So what I actually see is a little bit of the other side of that. I think with patients getting sicker and all of these, the sort of glaringness of the disparity becoming really evident. I see the hospital putting more resources into social work, into bringing social workers, and we call case managers, into the emergency departments earlier on to help people through this. I actually see the hospital doing some good stuff, doing some right stuff to try to help during this. So.
All right, cool. So I'm going to take that from Vatsala, we discussed. And I just want to kind of switch back to a question for Dr. Walls about, as we know, I mean, this is changing in some ways, it's slowly getting back to normal, but I know that for a while, especially since the start of the pandemic, many people that need therapy as part of their treatment for themselves as a person, that has been transferred to online. And I was wondering how you feel about the potential negative side effects of that, like the risk that it imposes on privacy. And, you know, it can also make anxieties worse in a lot of situations, especially people being treated for things like social anxiety might be worsened by having to go on Zoom for that. So I was wondering how you feel about that.
Apparently I still don't know how to use Zoom and couldn't unmute myself. So, you know, I have a couple thoughts on this. One is, I think that both during the pandemic and afterwards, telehealth has its place and it's really valuable in some ways. There are certainly barriers, and I'll kind of talk about the questions you asked, but I think, you know, we've talked a couple times already about this concept of inequity and inequitable access, right? And I have found that during this pandemic, my my patients who are perhaps lower income or don't have as good of transportation think that telehealth is a really great option. So I think we sort of have to look at it from that equity lens a little bit of it's not the only option, but I don't like it to not be an option at all. From a privacy standpoint, most big systems, right? So our big hospital systems have platforms that have HIPAA protected privacy into them. A lot of private therapists don't. And so folks are sort of signing something saying like, we know we're using Zoom, right? We know this has its risks, but its benefits probably outweigh them. There were federal laws about HIPAA compliant ways of doing telehealth, and we pulled them down and waived them during the pandemic. So the Health and Human Services federally stopped those on purpose. And the reason is that we couldn't get good enough access for enough people quickly enough. My suspicion is that those will get put back in place at some point. And so I think the privacy thing will kind of go away because we'll be forced to use those private servers again. But the reason that it was taken down is really just because, you sort of said it, right? This was new, we had to get thrown into it. And so I think some of those things are just sort of necessary at this point. We know that, there is good treatment and good therapy, and there's not so great treatment and therapy, right? And so it really depends what we're treating, and it depends who we're talking to. And sure, if we're seeing a kid who we say, or a teenager who we say, this is really about social anxiety, and it actually seems better to come into office, then we have to problem solve how to do that. I think almost every therapist I know is back in person at least part-time now, because we want to be able to parse that out. If it's better for a patient to be seen in person, let's see them in person. But if it works for that family to be seen, via telehealth, it's helpful. The example that I think for me as a psychologist is helpful is I have a patient who I've seen for a really long time who was pretty high functioning. And we had a FaceTime therapy session one day because we couldn't get Care Connect to work. And she was in her bed at 3 p.m. And I saw it and I was like, what the heck is going on? And we had this long conversation about how her anxiety had sort of turned to depression. So in some ways, it gives you more access to people's lives and can make some people more comfortable. But I do think that if you are in therapy and you're like, this is not going as well, it's worth having that conversation with your therapist. I have quite a few kids who are back in my office now and seeing me in person because they prefer it. And we mask and we space and we follow the rules, but we can do it safely now. And so I think I'd really encourage people to think about not what are the overall effects, but instead, if I'm in therapy, what are the effects for me? Or if my child or family member is in therapy, how is this working for them? Because it's always going to be that way to some extent. And we know that certain treatments for certain psychological disorders are better than others and work better probably in person than via telehealth. There's others that it's just fine to do telehealth. So I think it really is dependent upon what we're looking at. And I think it's really important for you all to be your own advocates. If it's you or if it's your friends saying you can ask for what you need, right? Just like in the medical setting, the mental health world is a lot harder to navigate. But you would, if you were sick, your parent would say they need to be seen in person because I'm not sure what this rash is. So the same thing kind of goes we can't figure this out. Telehealth doesn't seem to be helping. How can we sort of do this further? So I think really that's the most important piece.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point to look at it from an individual point of view because, two people both being treated for the exact same disorder might have completely different symptoms, completely different reactions to therapy. So yeah, I think that's really interesting. And I'll pass it to Natalie for her question.
I have a question for Dr. Stowens. With the vaccine rollout, there's been some hesitancy in Black Americans. There's always been a dark history in the U.S. with testing on Black Americans medically and misinformation about their health care for them. This has caused a lot of Black Americans to want to opt out of taking the coronavirus vaccine. How will you and your other colleagues and medical professionals instill some confidence in Black Americans that the vaccine is safe since this community is the most impacted?
Yeah, that is the $1 million question. How does a white guy who didn't suffer under the same past, right, who didn't have the same thing happen to his ancestors, convince you that it won't happen again? I think, man, I don't have a great answer for you. Thought about it, and I think you lead by example. I think having the conversation is really important. I think that if a patient of mine who's a person of color talks to me about the vaccine, and I can have that conversation. I hope I can instill confidence in them. I hope I can empower them to make that decision. I hope I can answer all the questions. I hope they can see that I understand that, like, that intrinsic fear because of what's happened in the past. Like, I think it's through communication and through seeing that I understand that maybe I can somehow communicate that I think this is safe and this is safe. But I think that the next pandemic, if there ever is one, God willing, there won't be. But hopefully, when that rolls around, we'll have more of a balance in my profession. We'll have more African American doctors, Black and brown doctors, non-white doctors. We'll have more of them, and so we'll have a better balance of the leaders, so that there is better trust, and not just with vaccines, but with all aspects of care. That the disparities that we have right now, the racial disparities will hopefully get better. But I think the only way through this right now is through really sort of one-on-one communication and seeing leaders and also seeing leaders on a larger stage, heads of hospitals, heads of state, leaders at the highest level, talking to people and saying this is safe for you to take. This won't hurt you, and then going forward and seeing that it doesn't. I think those are the two ways we can get through this.
Yeah, it definitely is hard. Do you think that the Black healthcare workers actually making campaigns for information would help this effort too?
100%. Yep. I said it's hard for a non-target group to reassure the target group, so to speak. Yeah. Our leaders in our Black and brown leaders in healthcare will help drive this, and already are.
Yeah, I will just add, I was actually on a phone call at 5 o'clock today about some of this vaccine hesitancy with people. We have something called our Drive Task Force, which is basically aimed at, like, how do we do better at diversity inclusion efforts. And one of the other things I'll add is that I think this isn't just on the healthcare world. So we're partnering with community churches. Faith leaders are people that are very trusted. We partner with places like, I don't know if you guys are familiar with Kingswood Community Center. Logan Herring is a Black man who grew up in that area of Wilmington. And so the community really trusts him, but he now is CEO. And so he runs a lot of their events there. So we did COVID tested sites and flu shots at their community centers. So I think the other piece of this is not just healthcare providers, it's how do we get the community activated? And when I think about all of your perspectives of activism, I think one of the things to think about is, like, sometimes you have to have boots on the ground, even if it's not something you're super comfortable with. So, we talked today about, like, there may have to be a bunch of us who go into certain neighborhoods and knock on doors and just tell them that we're going to do COVID vaccines or things like that, with trusted partners who go with us, so that they're actually faces that people say, oh, I know that person, not just they're a Black doctor, but they're my Black pastor. And that really, really makes a difference. That buy-in, when we do flu clinics, that's where we see the buy-in come in. It's not from us. It's not from even my Black and brown colleagues a lot of the time, because they're still sort of seen as removed sometimes, but instead it's from community members.
Yeah, thank you. I'm gonna pass it on to Jack.
All right, so my question's for Dr. Stowens. I've kind of gotten interested in epidemiology recently, so I wanted to know, since you're a frontline guy, we've learned a lot about antibiotic resistant infections. I wanted to know how many of those, how common it is to see that, and if it is common, what's the likelihood that could develop into something bigger?
So we're talking outside of COVID right now. You mean antibiotic resistant bacterial infections?
Yes.
Yeah. We're definitely seeing more of it. Although we're countering it with the word we use is antibiotic stewardship. When I was, I can't believe I'm about to say this. When I was your age, And I went to the doc. There was probably a 90-something% chance I was going to get amoxicillin for whatever it was that ailed me, and there was probably a 10% chance that I probably needed it. But the times have changed, because when you give antibiotics to everybody for everything, that's what happens. The bacteria that survive get resistant to it. And so the antibiotic doesn't work as well the next time you do it. You get, they call them superbugs, right? You get bacteria that are resistant, and then you got to come up with a new antibiotic. And if you ever Google all the different names for all the antibiotics, we spend a good half a year memorizing all of them. There's so many because of the resistance. And so, yeah, you can run out if you're not careful. But within the last 10 or 15 years, we've really come in, we've recognized this. And so we're using antibiotics a little bit better now. We are making sure that that's the right drug to give. And so the antibiotic resistance, as it definitely still gets worse, is getting worse a little slower. And so we can really, as sort of frontline docs, can have a real impact on it by using it when we need it, and really telling people, hey, you got a runny nose, you don't need some antibiotics for this one. That said, we definitely do see a lot more antibiotic resistant infections, especially in the emergency department, because they can make you really sick. And so, a little sick, you might go to your family doc, really sick, end up in the ER. And yeah, so we'll see them there. And I'd probably see 1 or 2 a week. I think maybe a little bit more than that. But we still have some antibiotics that we reserve for those, some pretty powerful ones that we don't use for other stuff. And it still seems to work most of the time. So yeah, we'll see. There are some diseases that are getting a little bit more, resistant, but those are the focus of the new antibiotics. So that answers your question.
Yeah, it does. I honestly missed who's next on the list. Mallory, if you want to give them that, I'm sorry.
Yeah, no worries. That's Kaylee. So go ahead, Kaylee.
Yeah, hi. So I have a question for Dr. Walls. So I actually want to be a child life specialist. That's what I kind of want to be in my next, step in my life. Is that kind of what you do? If not, is there any kind of correlation in between the child life specialist and what you do?
Yeah, it's the smart path because you get to go to school for less years. The real answer is I love our child life specialists. We have the best at our hospital. They are phenomenal. There's overlap in what we do. So their training is a little less time, and their focus, is really on things like helping kids cope with specific things like procedures, right? So how do we distract a kid while they're going through procedures? And psychologists do that too. We're trained in a lot of those kinds of things. But often it will sort of be like a partnership where we have both the psychologist and the child life specialist involved. So the child life specialist is doing things like meeting the kid at their MRI and actually walking through with them, right? We're going to show them what happens on this bear. And a psychologist might be in there before talking about how do we cope with anxiety in general, and how do we deal with the aftermath of knowing we just have a cancer diagnosis, right? So similar, I think, in that a lot of the job is how do we get kids to adjust to hospital stays or to diagnoses. Child life specialists have a more hospital-based job than a lot of ped psychologists. So we're in the hospital, we're in primary care sites, we're sort of out in the community a little bit. But I will say, I don't think there's any people happier than child life specialists. They love their jobs. Ours adore the kids in the hospital. They are phenomenally well liked by everyone, because the fact of the matter is child life specialists make everyone's job easier. It makes my job easier if I don't have to, pop out of a patient session to meet a kid somewhere. It makes our physicians' jobs easier because the kid's not screaming while they're trying to talk to the parents. It makes our tech job easier because they're not having a kid who's screaming and wiggling when they're trying to do their procedures. So definitely related. It's a great job. And I think it's a really impactful job too.
Thank you so much. I completely forgot who I'm going to pass it over to. I'm going to pass it over to Kate if she's ready.
That's so funny. I was actually next anyways. So I have a question for Dr. Walls. I know that a lot of people are struggling during the pandemic with their mental health, and was wondering, with so many resources out there, which ones would you recommend, and which ones, any resources that you could recommend to people?
Yeah, so that's a really good question. I think Google is like a really terrible tool sometimes because we just put in what we want and things pop up, right? I think that the first tools are actually things that I just tell everyone that I think we should be doing, which as teenagers is probably really hard. The first one, which is sleeping. It sounds really silly, but like mental health tools are great. But the truth is that what protects us from negative effects on mental health and what keeps us mentally healthy, the basics are a lot of our sort of like, I hate the word self-care, but I guess they're like basic care, right? So sleeping a lot or enough, right? So most of you probably have a little bit more flexibility with some more online schooling, right? But I see most teenagers getting way less sleep than they should. Teenagers really should get up to 10 hours of sleep, not just 8 like adults. And that's really hard when you have to get up at 6 a.m. and you're going to bed at 4 a.m. or even midnight talking to your friends. So sleeping, making sure you are eating regular meals, but also making sure during this time, during a pandemic, that you're doing things like getting out of your bed. It sounds silly, but like have a purpose, right? Have a sense of time. Do not stay in your pajamas all day. Take a shower. Those things are really important. The other thing that I think is really important is having some kind of social support. So whether that is group texting with your friends, FaceTime, coming to things like this, right? We have to still make sure we're reaching out. In terms of actual resources, there's a lot out there. There are a lot of great apps. The Calm app, which I'm sure some of you have heard of and have, and the Headspace app are probably my 2 favorite apps to use because they're both free and you can pay for extra if you want it. But I think they're really easy to use. The other thing is, when I think about like adolescent stress and sort of what's happening, so much of what's happening in your own lives are like, we're out of school and we have all these crazy hormones and all this stuff is happening. And so a lot of times I think the other piece that happens is there's this like sense of like physical anxiety of like, I can't sit still, I can't settle. There's an app called Belly Bio. It is probably my favorite app for kids and teenagers alike. You literally put your phone on your stomach so you can't look at it while you're doing this, right? No one can like text you and bother you. And it plays you music when you finally slow your breathing down to the appropriate pace. And we call that biofeedback. Your body is actually doing something and we're getting biological feedback, and then you get some kind of sign, right? So for like in office, we do this with like, we'll measure people's temperature, but at home, this is a really easy way to do it. And then the other thing that I think is really important, and I always mention this when people ask about resources, is that if you feel like things are getting overwhelming, you can't sleep, you can't eat, you're not wanting to hang out with your friends, I think the biggest resource there is therapy. And I know it's kind of hard to find the right therapist sometimes. And, I have lots of patients who say to me, therapy didn't work. And I always say, well, maybe you had the wrong therapy or the wrong therapist. So the other piece of advice I give people a lot is, if you go to therapy once or twice and you're like, this is not for me, maybe you haven't found the right fit and maybe you need to try again. But I've also been really encouraging people that when things start to get rough lately, that's the first place I'd go, because we don't want to wait until it's really bad. And you don't have to wait until it's really bad, because you wouldn't wait until your arm is falling off to go to the doctors, right? You would go when there's pain. And so I tell people the same things. Well, actually, Dr. Stowens sees the people who wait until their arms are falling off because he's in the emergency room. So he's like shaking his head yes over there. He's like, I wish they would go when their arms weren't falling off. But really, I just think it's so important that we take really good care of our mental health. And we can do all these things and work on preventive strategies. But I also just, every time I talk to any group, teens, adults alike, I just sort of emphasize the importance of therapy and making sure that if you do feel like you're struggling, that you feel comfortable asking for treatment.
Thank you so much. I'm going to pass it off to Liv.
Hi, my name is Liv. So I'm about to give a little speech about my personal experience with mental health and a little bit of background info. I've dealt with anxiety from a pretty young age, and I started experiencing symptoms of depression at the start of high school, and this is it. So my mental health journey started in 9th grade when I started experiencing a lot of negative emotions. I kept thinking it's just a bad week, I can get through it. This was a continuous process for the next year or so. I thought it would pass until I had a realization this shouldn't be and isn't normal behavior. That is probably something a little bit deeper. Fast forward to the spring of my sophomore year, everything I experienced the prior year was 10 times worse. I was starting to really dislike the person I had become. I couldn't control my feelings and I would lash out at those around me. I barely went to track practice, and when I did, I would break down and cry. The thought of getting through a 7-hour school day felt mentally and physically impossible. At this point, I decided to speak up for help. My parents were already aware of what was happening and offered to get me help, but I didn't want it. I was under the impression that I had it under control. I'm now a senior in high school. The summer between my sophomore and junior year was probably the lowest point. There were often days where my parents would have to convince me to get out of bed or get out of the house. When I did, I'd be sporting unbrushed hair and an old t-shirt and shorts. I was pretty miserable. I can thankfully say I haven't reached that point since. My doctor told me there are 3 things you need to do every single day. Take a shower, get up and move, and spend time outside. My coping mechanisms consisted of going for a drive, journaling, going for a run, coloring, and many other things. Self-help books became my holy grail, and it wasn't until this year I discovered the benefits of meditating. Even with the highs and lows I've experienced the last couple of years, I wouldn't change anything mental health-wise. Spending time at therapy and psychiatrist appointments while being open about my struggles has allowed me to become a better person. The pandemic has felt like a long downhill. When our 2-week break was announced, I honestly felt relieved in a way. I knew my mind and body could get much needed rest, as well as having the chance to catch up on my many missing school assignments. Our prediction for the next few weeks was very wrong. For a while, I was overwhelmed and constantly having panic attacks. The lack of a daily schedule made every day blur together. Due to current circumstances, there has been an increase in depression and anxiety symptoms, as well as substance abuse in the world. It's difficult to find excitement because of COVID-19. It continues to strongly impact minorities such as essential workers, those with pre-existing conditions, and unemployed. Mental health in the midst of a global pandemic is vital and needs more recognition. And then I have a follow-up question for Dr. Walls. What is your opinion on mental health regarding the pandemic?
First of all, thank you for sharing. I think, a couple things. One thing that's happened during the pandemic is that more people are sharing about their mental health. I have seen that across the board, from teenagers to adults to my own friends who are willing to sort of do what you did and say, I'm going to tell my story because it might help someone else. And I think it's just incredibly important. I mentioned in the beginning that we sort of worried from the beginning that a wave would come of mental health difficulties after the pandemic. I think that wave is here. We have really long wait lists some days. We have more, I think, teenagers who are struggling with depression. And I think it's really expected and normal in some ways. We've locked people in houses, which we've had to do. And, Dr. Stowens can tell you, I am good at following the rules, and I tell my patients to follow the rules, but it's hard. And so those things that I talked about before, that like sense of purpose, sense of time, sense of place, showering, getting dressed, going outside, all the things you talked about too, are far harder right now. And we're combining that with the stresses on adults of things like job loss, illness in families. And so it's not really surprising to me that we're seeing this sort of uptick in presentation for mental health. But honestly, mental health has sort of been, I think, like the black sheep of the healthcare family for a long time. And we haven't talked about it a lot because, well, I have, but people haven't talked about it a lot because it feels scary to talk about. And, it feels like, oh, maybe there's something wrong. But I think what COVID has done in a very different way than I've ever seen before is sort of lay out how difficult it is to cope with big things that are traumatic, right? So, the saying we sort of say about COVID is like, we're all in the same storm, but we're not in the same boat, right? So we've talked a lot about inequity. We've talked a lot about how that sort of shakes out. I expect that we're going to see the same outcomes with mental health, that those communities are going to be more impacted by the negative effects of mental health as well. But I think what it has done is it has given us this sense of we can all understand a little bit. Even if we can't understand all of it, I don't know anyone who hasn't felt sad or cried or felt anxious during the pandemic. because it's hard. And even if it's just a moment, right? I miss my friends. I wish I could do this. And I think it gives us a sense of empathy. So my hope is that this becomes mainstream to talk about and that people keep telling their stories. I know we're going to see some fallout from it. It is a stressful job right now to do this job, but I think it's really important that we keep talking about these things. And I give you guys all a lot of credit because I think your generation of teenagers is thinking about this very differently than when I was a teenager, and no one talked about going to therapy and no one talked about mental health, and no one would have invited a psychologist to come join a talk about something that, you know, is on its face value, not mental health, right? COVID is a medical illness, but I think that it's really has in some bizarre ways helped to sort of say lots of people go through this. This is really common. And I will say that again, that's true from teenagers all the way through. Like there are physicians who come talk to me now and say, hey, can you recommend a therapist for me, who would have never done that before. So I think we've sort of gotten to this place where we know the pandemic's making it worse, but it's also sort of opening up the conversation. So I think we're seeing both sides of the coin there.
Yeah, I think just having the conversations, like you said, and starting the conversation is the first step. And I think the stigma is so it's becoming so apparent since the conversations are happening now. Just seeing how some people are reacting to that is really making it obvious. You know, the brain is just a body part, and at the end of the day, if your heart was having problems, if your stomach was having problems, then you would go to the doctor, and no one would shame you for that. No one would think that it was embarrassing. No one would think that it was something that should stay personal, something that should stay private, because people would give you sympathy, people would give you extra support. And I think it's really important that we kind of bridge the gap between physical and mental health, because they don't really have to be as separate as they are, because they're not really separate. I mean, they're treated different ways, but it's at the end of the day, it's just a body part that's hurting, and it's just something that you need to address. So I think that before I kind of wrap everything up, I'm going to open up the floor to more questions, both from our YouTube chat. If anyone in the YouTube chat wants to put a question, the doctors, I'm sure will be fine with answering it. And also, of course, my members, if you guys have any more questions, now's the time for that. So does anyone have any other questions that they want to pop in with?
I'll just say something really quick. I really appreciate what you guys are doing. I've unfortunately lost, family members to COVID, and it's the people like you that still kind of make me feel good. Like, okay, they're helping other people. And I just want to thank you for everything that you're doing and that you will continue doing, and everything that you have done to help people who are currently going through this really tough time in the world.
I have a question for Dr. Stowens. Just as schools are opening back up, and that's a big thing happening right now, and it's the transition time is kind of happening. A lot of schools in Delaware are opening back up that haven't been open before. So I was wondering what you think the effect on schools being open will have on the spread of the COVID disease, and how you think that affects the overall scheme of things.
Let's hope it has a very minimal effect as schools open, if we do this right, and if the timing of this is done appropriately, and especially with regards to the timing to vaccine and protection of our teachers. We're definitely hoping to get into that phase of opening schools. I'm actually sure you guys are really looking forward to seeing your friends in person again too. I think. I think we're on the cusp, and it appears that we're doing it with the right amount of equipoise, a really cautious balance of when we go the next step, when do the next group go back, when can we put more people into a room together, how do we make those rooms safe? You hear those questions being asked at like school board meetings, and you hear our leaders talking about it, and I think that's really reassuring that we're making those decisions and going back in a really balanced fashion. We are hoping that this school year, we'll get back to it, especially if numbers continue to do what they're doing and people continue to get vaccines, and we continue to get vaccines out. That is the hope. I guess my answer is that I'm reassured that people are thinking about it and not just willy-nilly making a decision, but looking at sort of where we've been and what's worked.
Yeah, thank you. I think that's great for all of us to hear because, a lot of us are in school. I know me and Vatsala both go to St. Mark's and URETSI, and we've been in school since September. And I also know some people in this call or watching at home that still aren't back at school. And so it's different for everyone. And I think that's really, it's just a completely changing time, and it just keeps changing as it's going on. And just, yeah, thank you both for being here so much tonight. Does anyone else, before I kind of wrap up, does anyone else have a question that they want to ask?
I had a question for Dr. Walls. With everyone like basically being in some level of quarantine for a year now, like everybody's been kind of feeling cooped up and like stir crazy. What are like little hobbies or things that you'd recommend to get people to feel like there's a purpose in waking up, or that this day isn't pointless, or just like some type of normalcy? Because I know I've felt like lost interest in things that I used to do every day because it's like every day is the same now.
Yeah, that's an awesome question. So to me, it's less about what those things are and that you have things. So, Olivia kind of talked about like what are the things we do, right? We get out of bed, we go outside. I actually really strongly recommend that every night you write down 3 things you're going to do the next day. I don't care how little they are. They could be watering your plants. And I try to do this for myself when I can and when I remember, but a lot of my teenage patients write stuff like go on a 20-minute walk, right? Or, I'm going to call a friend, but I'm going to schedule that phone call. We're not just going to try to connect at some point today, but I'm going to like actually make an effort to make that schedule. If you can write down 3 or 4 things you're going to do the next day, it gives you that sense of purpose, right? So it gives you that sense of like, oh yeah, I have this list to do, and not, I always tell you, it should be pleasant things, like not, I have to like clean out my closet today because my mom told me I have to, but things that you actually like doing. So not a to-do list. Instead, I often call it like a what I get to do list instead of a to-do list. And I really actually think it helps to think about it as, what are the things I really like that I can still do? Because you're right, we all feel that way. Every single one of us, adults, kids, teenagers, feel that way. But the more we can find small things to do, I think the better off we will be, because it gives you that sense of purpose. And I think the social piece is really big. So I tell people, try to have one of those things being connecting with some other human in some way.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much for everything that you guys have contributed to tonight. I feel like you said earlier, I think not everyone would have made the decision to have 2 very different topics kind of bridged, but I think the reason we did that was because we just wanted to see kind of how these things have so much more in common than is talked about. And I think that's a really important conversation to have, and having the conversations that are difficult to have, like Natalie brought up earlier with the history of vaccinations in the Black community and conversations about mental health. We're having difficult conversations all around, and I think everyone's adjusting to it really well. So yeah, I think this is a really great conversation. Thank you both so much for being here. I'm sure I'll pass it over to Mallory to say thank you as well.
Yeah, I also wanted to say thank you. Also, Liv, I loved your speech. It was really good. Yeah, I think it was good for all of us just to kind of gain. I mean, I know personally, I definitely gained more of a perspective. A lot of the things you guys talked about tonight, I didn't even really consider before. So just thank you for opening our eyes to a lot of different new ideas. Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, and reiterating what Mallory just said, Liv, thank you so much for sharing that, and I'm so grateful to you for sharing that. I know it takes a lot to share that, and just watching you have been doing that over your social medias has inspired me to do the same. So I'm just really grateful for all that you do, and you are incredibly strong. So thank you so much for sharing tonight.
Thank you so much.
Of course. And yes, thank you all so much for being here. Just some reminders for everyone watching at home that this will be up on our YouTube page following today. This will be uploaded so you can share this video to friends and family. If you are interested in joining, the criteria for generation activism is that you just have to be living in the United States and under the age of 18. So we would love to have you join. Everyone is welcome. And our social medias are generation.activism for Instagram and TikTok, and Twitter is GENACT2. So if anyone has any questions, I'm the executive director, Mallory, and our communications director is Mallory Holloway. So you can reach out to either one of us with any questions that you may have. Thank you so much for tuning in. and we will see you guys soon. So thank you, doctors, for joining.
Thanks,
More
Mel.
than welcome. Thanks for having us. It was great.
Have a good
Of
night.
course, thank you so much.